Once we have the initial structure of a table created, then comes the time to do one of two things, or maybe two of two things. It kind of depends on what you're doing. Either way, we need to know how to get content into the table, and we probably need to make some adjustments to the physical layout of the table as well. We're far enough along in our word processing skills that we're not going to talk about entering text into tables, primarily because it's just like typing anywhere else in Word. All the same rules apply. Text will auto-wrap within a cell. We can use all the same formatting tools. Even lists can be placed inside of a cell. Probably the only thing that deserves mentioning is that we can press Tab to move from cell to cell. If you'll notice, the cursor is currently on the first row in the first column of the table that we have, starting off with our worst, median, and best case scenarios. I'm simply going to demonstrate what some of the movement techniques are here. Normally in a document, when we press Tab, it moves about a half an inch or to the next tab stop. When we press Tab in a table, it takes us from cell to cell. Likewise, Shift-Tab takes us from the right to the left, cell to cell. Does that mean that you can't actually use tab stops within a cell in a table? Actually, no, we can use tab stops, but in order to do so, we have to press Control-Tab. Now watch the screen this time because I'm pressing Control-Tab on my keyboard. Here you can see the tab stops that we're used to seeing. We'll do it one more time. So you can now see that we're 2 tab stops over. And again, just like in a normal document, if we press Backspace, we can get rid of those. So that's one of the primary differences, is you use Tab and Shift-Tab to move from cell to cell, but you use Control-Tab to actually use tab stops within a cell. The rest of moving about in a table is just like you would expect. Of course, you can always click with your mouse, and you also can use your up and down arrow keys to move up and down and left and right. Depending on where your cursor is within the content, left and right arrow keys will either move you from character to character or to the previous or next cell. Likewise, up and down will move you from row to row unless a cell entry has multiple rows. Then you have to be at the top or the bottom before you can move to the next or previous cell. Everything else remains the same about typing and moving the cursor though. If you haven't used tables before, you'll get the hang of these few differences very quickly, I think. Now, we want to move on to the really big topic that we want to cover here, and that is manipulating the structure of tables. If you've taken any training with me before, you've probably heard me say, in order to be affected, it must be selected. Same for tables. So let's do some quick selection review. What do you need to select in a table? Well, tables are structures. You have the overall container for the table, and then you have rows and columns within the table, and rows and columns are composed of cells, or the little boxes. If we want to select an entire column, the easiest way is to move just to the very top border until your arrow turns to a bolded down arrow, and then click. You will see that the entire column is selected. You can also use that down arrow to click and drag to select multiple columns. A little bit differently, but in some ways very similar, we can also select entire rows. This time we need to move all the way to the left, outside of the table. Get the white angled arrow, and just like selecting an entire line of text, we can simply click with the white arrow. Likewise, we can also click and drag to select multiple rows. There is a difference between this white arrow and the little black arrow that you will get if you move within a cell. And this is actually really important. Often we're working with entire rows and columns, and so the first selection techniques we just did are important. But what if we wanted to work with this cell? Well, we can click and drag, but when we click and drag, what we have currently done is only selected the text, not the entire cell itself, and that can be important. In order to select the entire cell, we need to move kind of to what looks like a little left margin. This is where we get that heavy, diagonal black arrow. When we click here, notice how the selection changes. Now the entire cell is shaded, not just the text within the cell. So this is selecting the text, and this is selecting the cell itself. That actually is a good basis for us to talk about selecting a table. Often people will say, well, I'm just going to click and drag from the top left all the way down to the bottom right. What we have just done in this case is we have selected all of the text in the table, but we have not selected the table itself. In order to select the entire table, you can do a couple of things, but my favorite is to move all the way to the upper left. You'll notice just on the upper left corner, there's a little square with a four-headed arrow. If we click on this, that selects the whole table. And if you noticed very quickly, the difference was that by selecting this, it also includes all of these markers at the end. This is very similar to selecting text versus selecting the text and the paragraph mark at the end. Now, I tend to do these types of things right in the document because that's where I like to work. However, I don't want to forget to mention that the ribbon is useful as well. From the Table Tools tab, the Layout tab, on the left-hand side, we do have a Select option. Select a cell, column, row, or the entire table. I'm not sure, though, that that is any faster. As a matter of fact, often it takes a lot longer to come all the way into that option when we can simply click and select things in the table itself. Now that we know how to select, that was kind of half of our formula. In order to be affected, it must be selected, and so we've done the selection. Now let's work on modifying the layout itself. As usual, there are a couple of ways to do this. The Ribbons Table Layout Contextual tab offers easy-to-see options for almost everything we'll be doing, but I'm still old school and I like to work right within the document itself. So notice first, before we start getting to work, that we have this entire rows and columns group, and in here we have the option to insert above and below, insert left and right, so obviously the first two are about rows, the second two are about columns. We also can choose a variety of delete options, delete cells, columns, rows, or the entire table. Once we have things selected, then of course these options become appropriate. Let's play a little bit with manipulating the layout of our table by using some of these features. If we want to add something, the key is to always select first. So we have our top row selected. At this point, we could right-click, and we could choose Insert. And our options are the same as we saw on the ribbon. Columns to the left or right, rows above or below. We want to insert a row above the first row, so we'll choose that option. And there we have a nice new row. Likewise, if we wanted to have another column at the very end of the table, we could select the column, right-click, Insert, and this time choose Column to the right. Fortunately for us, it's just as easy to take stuff away as it is to add it. So with the same column selected, if we wanted to get rid of it, we can simply right-click and choose Delete. Notice this is going to be context sensitive. So if we have a column selected, it says Delete Columns. If we had a row selected, it would say Delete Rows. Now what we notice, though, is that the size of our table has been modified a little bit. Well, we can work with this ourselves, or we can let Word do it for us. If we want to modify the size of anything, we're going to look for the double-headed arrow. If we move to the right side of the table, we can get this arrow and we can simply drag to change the overall width of the table itself. To change the size of individual columns, we want to move to the column itself, and again, click and drag with the double-headed arrow. As you see, when spacing changes, of course the spacing changes everywhere. This is where the ribbon can actually be a little bit more helpful, because we have an entire set of options under the Table Tools Layout Contextual tab that will help us do this. We can designate the height and width of rows and columns. We can also say, I've been kind of dragging things around and I got them kind of messed up. Let's go ahead and distribute the columns evenly. One click puts it back the way that we want it to be. Likewise, we can control both the vertical and horizontal alignment. For example, top left, bottom right, or center center of how the text sits in a cell. And this can make it look very nice. Text direction lets us cycle through text. For example, let's go ahead and select one of our cells, and then let's use this option. We can see that we can rotate text in a variety of directions to get the best use. Unfortunately, when we rotated it sideways, it made our row taller, and that may not be what we want. But fortunately, we know that we also can come down, get a double-headed arrow, and simply drag that to be the height that we want. Let's keep it a little bit bigger than we need to. Select the row, and let's choose to center center. In other words, center it horizontally and vertically. Something like that. That makes it look a little bit nicer. Of course, the real way to make these things look nice, in my opinion, is to go back to the Home tab and turn off the non-printing characters. This is more of a WYSIWYG. We don't have to worry about what all of those characters mean, and it kind of cleans it up a little bit. Let's make sure we get back to our tab so we can see all of our tools. And so far, we've been working with the Layout tab. We talked about how we can manually change these things, but don't forget, when we created our tables initially, some of our options gave us some different things that we could choose, like AutoFit Contents, AutoFit Window, or Fixed Columns. Those are still available. No matter how you created your table, you can still use that to set the overall width of your table. We simply access it from the Layout tab. When we talked about drawing tables, we said that one of the abilities that we had there was to actually create kind of an inconsistent structure where it's not all 3 or 4 columns by 5 or 7 rows or something like that. We do have options like that though without having to draw. For example, if we wanted to put a title across the entire top of our table, we might say that we don't want to have 4 columns. We can use tools like merging cells and splitting cells to do just that. First, we have to select. So if we want this entire row to be one big cell, we select all of them first, we right-click, and we choose Merge Cells. Notice now that all of those individual columns are gone, and this is just one big cell. Likewise, if we wanted to split any cell, we can select the cell, right-click, and this time we're going to choose to split the cell. This one, of course, requires a little bit more information, so it asks us for the number of rows and number of columns that we want. Let's just say 3 to give it a unique number. Then we'll say OK. And now you can see that we have 3 evenly spaced columns. So it's kind of 2 ways of getting to the same conclusion. We can either draw a table to begin with, or we can use Merge and Split to customize the configuration of tables that we created in some other way. In this case, we actually don't want this top row. So we're going to select the row, right-click, and delete the row. One of the tools that we're actually not going to demonstrate here, but I wanted to mention, can also be found from the Layout tab under the Merge group. If we take a look, this is where we get to see our Merge and Split cell options, but there's also an option called Split Table. If you have a really large table and you decide that you want that to be 2 separate tables, you can click on the row where you want the split to occur, click on this option, and it will actually split it, just like it says, into 2 separate tables. That again is much simpler than some of the other things that people try to do to get that same effect, like cutting and pasting and then deleting rows and columns. This is much easier and simply a one-click solution. Having large tables isn't necessarily bad, but it does cause some issues that we have to be aware of. For example, if a table has a lot of rows, it may break across pages. And that means if you're looking at the 3rd page of data, you may not know what each column represents. It's better to have the titles that usually appear in the first row to appear on every page. Please do not select the top row, copy the information, try to figure out where it's going to break across a page, and paste this information in multiple times. Not only is that cumbersome, it's just not the best way or the right way to do it. Instead, what we want to do is select the row or rows in which our labels exist. In this case, it's our first row. Then on the far right side of the Layout tab, you'll see an option just above where we have formulas and convert to text that it says Repeat Header Row. We can click that, and now it knows that if this breaks across the page, anything designated as the header row should be repeated automatically. This way we don't have to try to do it, and it doesn't get hard-coded, so as our document structure fluctuates, we're not constantly going back in and trying to edit. Now this is actually part of our table properties. So let's move all the way to the left side of the ribbon, bottom left, in the table group, and click Properties. Every table has properties, and we don't come in here nearly as often as we used to because most of it honestly is on the ribbon. But you'll notice we have tabs for the table, row, column, cell, and alternative text. Here we can work with all kinds of things like how text wraps around a table, as well as the preferred width of columns if we want to do that. We also can work with borders and shading, and some different other options. If we click on the Row tab, this is where we can also work with the height of the row, but we also can say things like Repeat as Header Row. Remember, we just selected this on the ribbon. Here's how we do it from the properties. But what else might be important is we might not want to allow rows to break across pages. In other words, if it's more than one line, should it break across a page? The default is to say no, move the entire row to its own page. But we can check to allow a row to break across pages. Personally, I generally like to keep that turned off. We also see that there are similar options for columns and for cells, most of which, though, is easier to access right from the ribbon. The last one, though, that bears mentioning is alternative text. This means that if somebody can't see the tables, for example, if they have a visual impairment and they're using a screen reader, they actually can have the screen reader tell them what this should be. Here you could type in a title and a description, and that will be useful both for people with disabilities as well as for people who may be using browsers that can't use the table features that we have. We won't take time to fill those in, but it's good to know where those are, so we'll just go ahead and cancel. That's pretty much everything we need to know about working with the layout or structure of tables, but I did want to mention one more thing that I like to do. Let's go ahead and move to our References tab. Now I know this is taking us way out of where we think we need to be, but there's a feature here that is useful, both for tables as well as for things like illustrations, pictures, and images. It's called Insert Caption, and it's part of the Captions group. By clicking on it, it inserts a label. In this case, the default is just Figure 1, and we can just label it. For example, we could do a colon, and we could put a caption for what this table actually is, like, "You got it, market potential." We can choose the label to use. We also can choose whether to put it above or below. I typically like to put it below. We also could even exclude the label and just have it say, "You got it, market potential." But let's leave all of this like it is and say OK. What we can see is a reprise of the good old real estate saying about location, location, location. We had the top row of our table selected when we created the caption. Because pages can be structured using tables, and furthermore, tables can actually contain things like images themselves within cells, Word doesn't try to outthink us for once. When we said to put it below, it did exactly that, but it wasn't below the figure as we had planned, but below the selected text in this case. How would we fix it? Well, we'd simply select that caption and delete it, then begin our process over with the cursor properly placed. The caption would then be properly placed as well. Otherwise, the captioning process is exactly the same as we showed. Like so many other things in Word, it's very flexible and forgiving, so we can delete captions and even add new ones, including at any place in between existing captions, and Word will simply renumber them automatically. It's very easy to update, so don't be afraid to play with this feature a bit. And if it isn't exactly right the first time, just keep trying. When you have technical documents or things that have a lot of charts and graphs and pictures and tables, this can simply help the user identify what the information is supposed to be. Certainly isn't required, but it is a nice feature that adds good polish to your presentation. And with that, you now know how to structure tables. Beyond just creating them, you know how to manipulate them in many different ways to get them to have the look, the feel, and the capacity for what you need for your particular information.